All right, everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to talk about the articles that are a part of the work chapter. So first, we're going to get into the Schwartz et al. Article. I will let you know that I'm a bit biased of this article because Schwartz was on my thesis committee, and I know her personally. Corinne is an amazing human, and she does a lot of really, really good work on human trafficking and human trafficking prevention specialties. So those who work with people that are human trafficking. And last time I talked to her, she was in the middle or getting close to finishing her book. So I will let you all know when that comes around, as it is a really good resource and a really good writer. A reminder real quick that sex work and human trafficking are different, though those lines can get murky on occasion, and that's due to the topics that Schwartz and the rest of the colleagues were talking about. So talking about agency, vulnerability, and exploitation. So when we're talking about agency, we generally talk about that through the lens of ability to consent, through the lens of legal status to consent, through the lens of being able to make one's own choices. But to an extent, agency in any economic structure is impaired. So we have to work in order to make money, in order to make ends meet. So to an extent, our ability to opt out of work and be to have agency in that choice is limited, right? Because we have limited economic means. And that's no different for those who engage in sex work. And for those who do decide that that is the pathway for them to earn a living, they're doing so in a way that acknowledges with a situational awareness, for the most part, that acknowledges the ways in which that profession leaves you vulnerable or can be exploitative. And in the same way that, say, a professional football player knows that he is going to take harm to his body, and that playing that game is going to cause harm in some ways, he still has the agency to make that choice and go into that profession and make the amount of money that he wants to make in order to create a better living for himself. So these, again, having this ability to understand that while agency, even when limited, is still agency, is part of the conversation that these authors were really trying to get at. Now, what they also were talking about is that sex work as a choice for human work, and or the vulnerabilities that leave you vulnerable for human trafficking, are really built into our social structure, right? Especially our economic structure. And that structural injustice, including economic, medical, housing, and through education, cause and create systems where there are limited options. So your agency thus gets limited in what you can make, in how you can make money. And this comes down to, again, anti-immigration rhetoric is another aspect of this, because when you talk about it and you have limited ability to work in a legal way in a specific economic part of social, like part of the social, right, then you're limited in your other choices. And in doing that, you're creating anti-immigration policies, or creating a system where you're going to make women, especially immigrant women, incredibly vulnerable to not having other means of economic stability. The deepening poverty, incarceration, and what that does to the ability to create economic means post incarceration, anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric that leaves workplace discrimination, that includes workplace discrimination, and defunding welfare state and social options for individuals, all leave people in a very vulnerable place where making money is still necessary, but their options to do so become very limited. And so while, yes, women can make these decisions about, and men can make these decisions to engage in sex work, because that economic reward can be worth the, say, exploitative or not positives of the job market itself. They take a very anti-carceral stance, and that is just talking about the fact that the solutions to helping human trafficking survivors and to help sex workers are not to criminalize their behaviors and or to criminalize sex work. It's not to put them in incarcerated positions. That's not going to help them economically. That's not going to help them get rid of the means that put them in this position in the first place. And so really having conversations where the criminalization just doesn't take sex work out of the equation. It doesn't make sex work go away. All you're doing is creating more boundaries and barriers for the women who engage in sex work to do so safely, to do so in a way that maintains their own agency and autonomy. And so really having conversations about what criminalization does. And we did so a lot more in the lecture where we talked about human trafficking. And then they also talked about how the pleasure danger dichotomy, when we have this debate over whether or not sex work is a good idea or whether or not you support sex work, they get into this idea that either women are in it because they find pleasure in it, and that's why they work there, and or it's super dangerous and no women should ever do it. Like this dichotomy of only these two options or only these two arguments leaves the average individual or the average sex worker out of the conversation, because nobody takes jobs specifically because this is everything to me or this is the most worst possibility for me, right? Like we take jobs because we make calculations of nuance and understanding of our own situations, and we figure out what works for us and if that's feasible for us or if that's the only thing feasible for us. And this is true of any employment, any workplace environment. And so really having a conversation about how that particular feedback loop, that two polar opposite conversation isn't helping those who are geared to, or they say that they're trying to help. And what needs to happen is really to highlight the voices of those who are sex workers and human trafficking survivors and fulfill the needs that they're requesting, because that's when we start to have a more valid conversation. And that's just, again, getting at who gets to define and determine the needs, wants, and circumstances of other individuals. And what we need to do is start listening. And that is where we have more valuable conversations about these things. And then lastly, they talk about how pleasure is fluid and elastic, and that one can both dislike their job and find something good about it at the same time. And this is with anything in our lives, right? We can find something decent about whatever situation we are in, or we could find something that is not decent about anything that we're in. And that is life. And so treating sex work like it's inherently only one of those things doesn't get at the core structural things that get individuals into this position in the first place. The next one is talking about the country gender gap index, the global gender gap index, sorry, and just where we stand. It's 109 country index, and it talks about who's doing the best at closing the gender gap. Iceland is consistently ranked high. In 2020, I went in and found more recent data than is in your book, but in 2020, the US was 53rd out of 109 countries. And what they talked about is how to fix this is really through legislation, but also through corporate buy-in, that these practices and creating gender inclusive workspaces is beneficial to individuals. And I think that as you think about this article, I want you to also think about it when you're watching the TED Talk for the assignment that we're going to do in this module. And then lastly, the Higgins article talking about the age of patriarchy. And they start by talking about really the Golden Globes black dress event, where women specifically wore a lot of women wore black dresses to signify the need to address sexual assault in that industry and sexual violence and harassment in that industry. And Steve Bannon's, one of his many moments where he outright said this is just women trying to get back at the patriarchy because they want power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of started this debate over patriarchy. Is patriarchy this end all be all thing? Is this something inherent to humanity? All these things, which it is not, by the way. The majority of over the course of human history, when we're talking about human evolution history, the majority of our communities, our established social groups were matriarchal, and patriarchy, especially mixed into capitalism, is something that is still really new in the way of humans as a whole. But the literal meaning of patriarchy is the rule of the father, which again denotes this power differential between men and women. The oppression of women is baked into this, and it's systemically ingrained. And by that, I mean things like legal name changes, things like men getting paid more. All of these things lead to this male-dominated kind of society. And when we talk about it, them being institutionally asserted, you're going to see this in education systems. You're going to see this in the different institutions that we mold through. Religion is another one that you see this in pretty systemically. As with all other social constructs, though, the meaning is fluid. What patriarchy itself means has changed through the course of time because social dynamics change. And as social dynamics change, it shows that social constructs can be remapped, redefined, reworked. Patriarchy versus patriarchs. So patriarchs essentially are the individuals themselves and how they operate within a family or group dynamic. And so you have those who really intentionally are trying to make power at an individual male level, and then you have the system itself that adheres to those specific people, right? And then again, this debate, this word itself sparks this energy, this energizingness to both sides. You're going to see at a lot of feminist rallies. You'll see death to the patriarchy. You'll see down with the patriarchy. Like it's on pins, it's on shirts, it's on sweatshirts. It's, like this is a rally cry for both sides. And it's something that those who advocate that this gender specific arrangement is natural or something that we should have are also going to fight and energize around that word and their desire to keep it. So that's all for this module. I hope you guys have a wonderful couple of weeks. And as always, if you need anything or have any questions, please feel free to reach out.